So far, only 2 police officers have been charged, and there still hasn't been a full public inquiry. And there are many questions about what went wrong.
You had their own officers either indulging in the power trip or saying that this is awful. The one consensus I got that something wrong is happening here.
What the police did was not a surprise to me. I mean, the police are that violent every day in this city. They just aren't usually that violent on University to a bunch of white working class and middle class protesters.
I'm not necessarily opposed to mass arrests. If you see a lot of people breaking the law, you should arrest them. The problem I have is when a year goes by and you have 1,000 people arrested and only a handful of charges laid. It shows that either the police were arresting without cause or that the system of investigation and judicial proceedings is broken. I'm not sure which one it is. Neither is good news.
A lot of illusions were shattered on the role of police in society. I mean, if you're an Indigenous person or an immigrant to this land, that's probably your experience with police the majority of the time.
I think a lot of officers independently understand that this is hurting them. If they did their job there, this notion that they were all in it together is hurting their respectability, their accountability as police officers, and I'm hoping that someday somebody's going to stand up and just come out and be a whistleblower on the subject.
And this has been the single greatest violation, discounting what, Canadians have done to, Native or Indigenous nations, First Nations. This has been the biggest violation of civil rights in Canadian history. And I think some people are starting to realize that.
I think the police dropped the ball by spending too much time protecting themselves, not enough time serving the public.
The sense that I got was that they were arresting everybody and anybody that they could. I have a lot of friends that were engaged in peaceful activities that were arrested. Greenpeace volunteers were also swept up with no rhyme or reason. So I think it was just an attempt to just silence the protesters.
We reached out to the police and provincial and the federal governments and received these statements. So what's been the overall impact of the G20 1 year later?
I think people around the world saw that people in Canada care enough to actually put themselves on the line and throw down. It wasn't all peaceful and obedient. There was very much people that were in the streets fighting for a better world.
It's about that charter of rights and freedoms. It's about that basic right to, write what I feel on a sign and go out on the street and say, this is my view, and not be smashed in the face with a baton for doing so.
It's unfortunate to think that it would take something like that to open people's eyes, but maybe it has taken that. But I don't think it's actually changed anything about Canada. This is the same Canada we had. This is the same Canada we've always had.
The image of Canada being this democratic and just society was totally shattered. I mean, I was shocked, and I'm not the only one, obviously, right?
It's just ridiculous. Is this Canada? What happened? What happened to our country?
The whole world is watching! The whole world is watching! The whole world is watching!
I think that's the bigger question that needs to be answered is who designed the way this summit was going to end up?
Politicians are going like that. So Dalton McGuinty is saying that Stephen Harper should, instigate a full public inquiry into what happened. And Stephen Harper, as well as the NDP, is telling Dalton McGuinty that he should apologize for the secret G20 law.
It was his fault. No, it was the Premier's fault. It was their fault. No, it's everyone that was in a leadership role that weekend.
More than ever, when we do have these rights, we need to focus on protecting them. And that's why it's so important to fight for those rights and to call out our governments and our police officers when they're infringing them, because it's not acceptable.
You can't say every police officer is bad, every protester is bad. Both points of view are completely ignorant.
When this information keeps coming in a year after the fact, we're talking about the same people, the same stories, we're not any closer to an answer. That is something you can't ignore. That becomes very frustrating. It's very hard to argue that justice is being served when we're talking about the same thing a year later and almost no progress has been made.